So welcome back. Now that you've had a chance to get some background on the causes and the nature of trauma, I'd like to talk a little bit about what I've found to be an intrinsic relationship between trauma and spirituality, or between the transforming of trauma and spirituality. Now, suffering has been around as long as the human being has walked on this earth. And most all of the world's religions talk about suffering and about the transformative component of suffering. In the Christian Bible, there's the 21st Psalm, though I walk through the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. That's about moving through that canyon of trauma, the valley of trauma. There's the story of Job. And in the medieval mysticism, there is the dark night of the soul. Now, I'm not saying that suffering is equivalent to trauma, or that just through suffering we transform trauma. But suffering and moving through suffering clearly is a component in healing from trauma and transforming trauma. Now, there's another aspect of trauma. We talked before about the intense energy that's mobilized for trauma. Now, that energy is the survival energy. And those of you who are familiar with the ideas of the different body energy system, the so-called chakras from the Indian tradition of spirituality, that this root energy is the energy that for example, in the Kundalini Yoga and many different meditation practices, the person brings up that energy, that life energy, so that it can be fully experienced and transformed. And people who have been traumatized have already had that initiation. So if you work with this in a gradual way, in a slow way, you'll be opening to these energies and discovering the innate wisdom of the energy itself. As I said before, about the wisdom of our bodies. Now, another thing in working with trauma and transforming trauma is that it really requires, and many of the exercises in the program are used to help us really focus on our body sensations, and particularly in changes in our body sensations. And this kind of focus is the focus that you see in many of the martial arts, like Aikido, in Zen, and in different meditation practices, particularly in Vipassana meditation, where you're also following sensations. But here we're working with a much deeper energy, a much more powerful energy. But they really do, I believe, fit together in an integral way. So when I started working with people in the 60s and 70s, it became clear to me that many, probably the majority of them, described their experience as a spiritual one, and talked about how their lives had changed, that their lives were now involving more spiritual practice. They were attracted to spiritual practice. Probably the most comprehensive understanding of the role of suffering in the transformation of trauma comes from the Four Noble Truths of the Buddha. The first truth is that suffering is part of the human condition. It can't be, you can try to deny it, but it's there. And what happens is that if we try to deny it, then we actually create more suffering. If we simply try to avoid painful experiences, then we create more pain. At the same time, if we just go into these painful experiences over and over again, we also create unnecessary suffering. So the first truth is that suffering is part of the human condition. The second truth is that we need to find out the source of our suffering, why our suffering. And I talked about that before, about how it gets locked in our bodies. You know, it's really, I don't say it's completely independent of what caused that in the first place, but the real source of our present suffering is in our bodies, as well as our potential for transformation. The third noble truth is that suffering can be transformed, that it's inherently a transformable process. And then the fourth noble truth is to find the right method. And hopefully what we're offering here will help you in finding the method that works for you, because it's different for every person. And that's why I use different kinds of exercises so that each person can find those that really work for them.